How do we talk about queerness in the past? We live at a time when more people than ever identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, and queer. I'm very interested in thinking about how we can think about queerness upon the terrain of the long 18th century. And this is also a period which has bequeathed to us our modern regime of gender and sexuality. So the way in which we organise, think about sexuality and gender today actually comes from the Anglophone Enlightenment. What does queer mean in an 18th century context is one question that is, I suppose, the first question that we would think about if we were thinking about the queer 18th century. Or to put it another way, what does queerness mean in the 18th century? What does the queer 18th century mean to us now? The most important thing to remember is that words and their meanings change over time. So we know that people in the 18th century had same-sex intimacies and what we would call today queer experiences. But what those intimacies and experiences meant culturally, politically, socially, that meaning is vastly different to the meaning that we ascribe to same-sex intimacy today. And it's also a meaning that changes over time, is continually changing, even now. So as somebody interested in the 18th century, interested in gender and sexuality at that particular point in history, we must look at what language was available to people at that time. So a good place to start is to think about that word queer. And if we go to Samuel Johnson's dictionary, we can look up the word queer and we can think about what queer means in an 18th century context. So we have an outline of this definition here. In the dictionary, Samuel Johnson defines queer as an adjective of this word. The original is not known. A correspondent supposes a queer man to be one who has a queer to his name in a list. It means odd, strange, original, and particular. So queer is a perfectly fine word in an 18th century context. It means odd, strange, original, particular. There's nothing in this definition to suggest that Johnson is defining a particular type of person. There's nothing here that links queer specifically to sexuality, although we may see some signs of queer being linked to a particular kind of man. It's not quite there yet. So we have to be careful that when we're using words like queer, we're thinking about our own contemporary definition of queer, which may include sexuality or gender embodiment, but we're also thinking about the definition of queer that was available to 18th century people, 18th century readers, and we need to be careful that we're kind of thinking about those two definitions of queer, keeping those two definitions of queer alive in our own engagement with sources from the period. So when we want to think about queerness in the past, we may start with some of the work that's already been done. And there's been a few decades worth of work done on gay and lesbian history, which often pinpoints the 18th century as a starting point or a point in which gay, lesbian identity was beginning to emerge, to take shape. A really good theorist and thinker to read is Michel Foucault. And Michel Foucault started a project called The History of Sexuality. It was a 3-part project. Unfortunately, he died before it was completed. But the first volume of that project really begins with a big assertion about the history of homosexuality. And that assertion is really about acts versus identities. So Foucault talks about sodomy as a kind of act that people committed, and he talks about sodomy as being linked to canon, so church law, so it was a sin, but also civil law, so it was a sin, a kind of a crime that the state would punish. So he talks about how sodomy is linked to the law, how it is an act that somebody commits, but actually, as an act, it's an act that happens, it may or may not be punished. It doesn't mean anything about the actual person. It doesn't mean anything about them intrinsically. To be a sodomite is to be a sinner, essentially. And in his History of Sexuality, Foucault charts this up until the late 19th century, where he says there is a change in how sodomy is thought about, how it is defined politically and culturally. And theorists and historians have described this as the great paradigm shift. So what Foucault says, and we can see in the quote here, he's touching upon this, there is a move from sodomite or sodomy to the homosexual. And he even goes as far as to say that the homosexual becomes a species. The sodomite had been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species. What does that mean? Well, Foucault is talking about the 19th century. He's talking about the late 19th century. He's talking really about sexology. He's talking about a kind of mode of medical study which has branches of psychology and medicine. He's talking about sexologists like Hirschfeld, and he's saying that in their work, these what were known as perversions become kind of codified insofar as people who commit sodomy are now a particular type of people. Now, the sexologists used a particular category known as the invert to speak about this. Foucault doesn't use that word here. He uses another word which was coined in the 1870s, the homosexual. So we can see on the quote here, he says, the 19th century homosexual became a personage, a past, a case history, and a childhood, in addition to being a type of life, a life form, and a morphology, with an indiscrete anatomy and possibly a mysterious physiology. What does this mean? Well, it means that the homosexual is now a type of person. And this is the first time in history that people who commit sodomy are now viewed as being intrinsically different to everyone else. So to be a homosexual means, yes, you may commit sodomy, but even if you didn't commit sodomy, if you never committed sodomy, you are intrinsically different to what we would now call a straight person. So this is called the great paradigm shift. It's a move from sodomy being an act, the perpetrator of that act being nothing more than a sinner or a criminal, to sodomy now meaning something that is hardwired into the person, what Foucault calls the birth of the homosexual. And really, this part of Foucault's History of Sexuality, when it was published in the late 70s and translated into English from the French, when this was published, what happened was a field of study actually emerged, a field of historical study known as gay and lesbian history. Because this finding, this claim by Foucault, this great paradigm shift from sodomy being an act, to homosexuality being an identity, it became the entry point for historians, for activists, political activists, to start to think about homosexuality in history. They may not have agreed with Foucault that it happened in the late 19th century. In fact, many of them tracked it back earlier to the 18th, the 17th, and even the medieval period. But it gave people a framework to do the history of homosexuality. With this new framework that we get from Michel Foucault, this great paradigm shift, we start to think about homosexuality in history being a kind of question of acts versus identities. Now, modern gay lesbian identity is actually a very recent phenomenon. To identify as gay, lesbian, in a positive sense, this really starts to emerge from civil rights movements in the mid to late 20th century. So kind of post 1970s, when you have gay liberation, you have people identifying as gay and lesbian and forging a kind of social and political identity from that activism. And that is really what has led us to kind of have these sort of public identities that are gay, lesbian, bisexual, and indeed trans. Now, Foucault talks about the birth of the homosexual in the 19th century, and really the word that we could use also there is invert. It took many, many years for this kind of pathologization of queer people in the form of the invert or the homosexual. And by pathologizing, I mean medicalizing, and this is a kind of medical diagnosis. It took many years for that to be turned around and for people to use that medicalization as a kind of point of positive political affirmation of themselves, of their identities. Now, in the 18th century, we do have instances of a record of what we may term queer people meeting, assembling. The 18th century is a period of assembly. It is a period where people become more social, associational culture kind of booms in places like London. After the Great Fire of 1666, we have kind of the city being rezoned in many ways. Old parishes are kind of falling away. There is a sense that the city can be a place of anonymity. People can find newfound freedoms there. And we also have at this time a burgeoning print culture. So more people are reading. There is an availability of cheap print, and there is an interest, a newfound interest in the ways in which people are meeting, coming together, assembling in public. And there are publications that are tracking this kind of new associational culture. Now, one such publication is by somebody named Ned Ward. And Ned Ward is really what we would describe today as a kind of early journalist. So the kind of writing that he's doing is kind of like early journalism. One such publication, quite a popular one that he produced, is known as A Complete and Humorous Account of All of the Remarkable Clubs and Societies in the Cities of London and Westminster, and it was published in 1709. There's various editions of this that run on after that year. Now, in this publication, which is also known in another version as The Secret History of Clubs, Ward proposes a kind of a conceit. So he sort of pretends, or he puts forward that he is investigating these clubs. Now, we don't know if he actually investigated these clubs. We don't know if he went into different, meetings of people and sat amongst them and investigated what was going on. But this is the sort of the idea that's put forward in this publication. And he goes to different clubs. There's a club for ugly faces. There is a club for bird fanciers. There is a club for the market women of Spitalfields, kind of a drinking club. There's also a club known as the Mollies, or the Molly Club. And in this particular instance, Ward infiltrates this club. It's in a tavern, in a pub, and this is what he says he finds. He says, there are a particular gang of sodomitical wretches in this town who call themselves the Mollies, and are so far degenerated from all masculine deportment or manly exercises that they rather fancy themselves women, imitating all the little vanities that custom has reconciled the female sex. That custom has reconciled to the female sex, affecting to speak, walk, tattle, curtsy, cry, scold, and to mimic all manner of effeminacy. And it goes on, as you can see in the quote. Now, essentially here, Ward is describing a group of men in a tavern. He goes on to describe how they dress like women, how they speak in an affected way, how they act in an effeminate way, and how they also commit the indecencies of lewd women, that they may tempt one another by such immodest freedoms to commit those odious bestialities that ought forever to be without a name. So he's pointing here at same-sex intimacy, same-sex desire between men. Now, it's very interesting that in describing it, he also negates that description by saying that ought forever to be without a name. So he's raising the spectre of, we think, maybe sodomy, but not quite naming it. And this is a kind of trope within representations of queer intimacy, where it is the love that dare not speak its name, if we were to go forward into Oscar Wilde and Lord Alfred Douglas at the end of the 19th century. It's always something that is pointed to, but not named. So there's a kind of negation there. So we don't quite know exactly what's going on, but we know that these men are what we would term today queer. Now, this is a very slight and unstable passage upon which to build a reading of the queer 18th century. It is one entry in a number of entries in which Ned Ward infiltrates clubs and exposes the dealings within those particular clubs. However, it is an entry that has excited a lot of curiosity, a lot of speculation, and a lot of ink has been spilled by gay and lesbian historians on this particular entry in the secret history of clubs, the Mollies. Now, one particular historian, Richter Norton, has published a book known as Mother Clapp's Molly House, the Gay Subculture in England, 1700 to 1800. And Norton, in that book, references the Molly entry in Ned Ward's secret history as a kind of starting point for his examination of gay subculture. Now, Norton is also writing at a time, the book is published in 1992, but his work on this Molly subculture predates that in the 80s. And it's important to note that this scholarship is coming at a time when gay and lesbian activism is quite present in the kind of political mainstream. So historians like Richter Norton are writing about 18th century Mollies as gay men in a way that sort of legitimizes the activist concerns of gay and lesbian activists in the 1980s and the 1990s. So this is a really good example of how history, queer history, gay, lesbian history, is a kind of political tool at a particular point in history, because there is this sense that for some historians, we don't talk about, gay people in the past because they didn't exist. And in a way that is accurate. Gay people, as we understand gay people today, didn't exist in the past. It wasn't an identity that was available for people to claim or to step into publicly. However, we know that gay people did exist in the sense that there were people who shared same-sex intimacies, relationships that were meaningful, incredibly meaningful. So we do know that there were gay people in some sense in the past. Norton, in his study, is calling the Mollies gay. He's identifying them as gay men. And he's saying that entries in The Secret History of Clubs by Ned Ward can be used as a primary source for reading an early formation of a gay subject in the 18th century. And he kind of argues that this is possible because there is an atmosphere of moral panic at the time. You have societies like the Reformation, Society for the Reformation of Manners. You have people actively looking to punish those who commit sodomy. And he's saying that within this kind of pressured, kind of cultural and moral situation, this panic that surrounds sodomy, you have people kind of being identified as mollies, and therefore this kind of subculture is being sort of formed in this pressure cooker. That's the argument in his book, Mother Clapp's Molly House. Richter Norton's argument is a fascinating one, it's an interesting one, it's an important one, because at the time there was a sense that gay and lesbian activists could look to the past and find legitimacy for their own experiences in the past, which would in some sense buttress or strengthen their political demands for the extension of rights, privileges and permissions in the present. And that's a really important point. There is a look to the past in queer history, but it's always in some sense a look to the past that may provide some sort of power for political movement in the present. So I'm quite sympathetic to Richter Norton's branding of the Mollies as gay men in that sense. I understand that scholarship actually has a history and a place and was of its time. However, we don't have to look too far, a couple of years after Richter Norton's book was published, to find criticism of the way in which he did homosexual history, or the way in which he conducted gay history. So critics like Cameron McFarlane, in his book, The Sodomite in Fiction and Satire, 1660 to 1750, this particular scholar, McFarlane, he takes issue with Norton's kind of deployment of the word gay, its adjectival and nounal deployment upon the train of 18th century literature and culture. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, he says we can't really call them gay men because the word gay didn't have that meaning at the time. To call the Mollies gay men is anachronistic. That means it's taking a word that we understand in a particular way and kind of removing it from, our time period and placing it on a time period in the past where that particular word did not have that resonance, did not have that meaning. So to call the Mollies gay men is in some way to be anachronistic. And Cameron McFarlane makes that argument. He also makes a point. He says that, the source that Richter Norton is using for retrieving gay men in the 18th century, the Molly House entry in The Secret History of Clubs, he says that's a biased source. That's a source that is actually a satire on those men. It is a source that is kind of represents the kind of what we would call the homophobia, or certainly the phobia that surrounds mollies at that time. And really, in reading it, we have to be careful about reproducing that phobia. We have to talk about it in those ways. We have to ensure that we are not normalizing or naturalizing the homophobia that is contained within that source. So for Macfarlane, Norton's use of the word gay, his recuperation of a gay 18th century identity, also recuperates, however unwittingly, the homophobia that is contained within that representation. And that representation sort of engenders. And this is a really crucial point by Macfarlane, because this is a problem that a gay, lesbian, trans historian will come up against again and again. The archive that we are dealing with is always an archive that is going to contain homophobia, transphobia. It's always going to be a negative space. When we turn to the archive, we are turning to often records that are phobic, that are painful, that are damaging. We very rarely get to hear the person who engages in same-sex intimacy. We rarely get to hear them speak. We often get to hear them described, as is the case with The Secret History of Clubs. And that description is often satirical. So it's often about undercutting that experience, making sure that that experience seems sinful or less than other kinds of intimacies, heterosexual intimacy, for example. It's always about ensuring that there is ridicule going on. So as historians, as people who deal with the past, we need to be aware that in our reading of the queer past, we risk naturalizing something that we surely do not want to naturalize or to leave unquestioned. Another issue with Norton's reading of the Molly as a gay man is that reading the Molly as a gay man forecloses other possibilities for how we may read the Molly in 2024 or in the 2020s, in the present day. Recently, a trans scholar known as Julia Facek has argued that Norton's insistence that the Molly should be read as a gay man in the 18th century, what this insistence does is it forecloses any possibility of reading the Molly as trans. Now, if we look back at that account of the Molly, phobic as it is, slight and unstable as it is, we do have an account of what we could view as men dressing in the apparel of the opposite sex, men presenting as women. And scholars like Facek have argued that really there is a case here for reading the Mollies as an 18th century trans subject, or at least there is a possibility of us having trans awareness when we read this satirical 18th century account of the Molly. Because at its core, it is describing what are identified as men dressing in the kind of apparel of women of the period. And not only dressing, but acting in ways that are described as effeminate, but may also be described as femme. Now, we have to be careful because, as I said before, this is clearly a phobic account. So we're reading this and we're aware that the description is biased. The description may or may not be based on something that Ward himself has seen. It may be something that he has heard or he has had described to him. So this is an unstable description. However, scholars like Fatchik wonder why, within gay history itself, the possibility of a trans reading of the Molly has only been raised in recent years. So there is a sense that there's much more work to be done on trans interpretations of 18th century materials. So I've discussed Ned Ward's The Secret History of Clubs, and I've discussed the very famous passage on the Mollies. Another famous 18th century source in the history of homosexuality is the trial record. So you can access trial records on the Old Bailey online, and you can type in sodomy and you can find numerous records of cases that have involved sodomy. These trial records are quite short. We don't get a lot of information, but there's one such record which is from a trial in July 1726, the trial of William Brown, that has recurred in gay readings of the 18th century. In this particular trial record, we get an account of really that kind of moral panic that I spoke about. So I spoke a little bit about the Society for the Reformation of Manners being set up, and part of that work was to kind of weed out sodomites in the urban space, to reform people's morality and manners. We also have a sense of the police at this time being involved in the kind of the disciplining or punishing of sodomites. And here in this trial record, we get an account of kind of 3 constables who set out to, they have a warrant to apprehend sodomites. So they set out to apprehend sodomites. We can see in the text here that they go to an alehouse, a pub in Moorfields in London, so perhaps a place known as a Molly Club. We don't know. That word isn't used here, but we know that they have identified this alehouse as a place where sodomites gather. And there is this kind of plan that Thomas Newton, one of the men, will be a kind of decoy and kind of pick up a sodomite who is in the vicinity. This is obviously a vicinity where men who have this interest, maybe they frequent this area in order to meet other men. So we're getting a lot from this source. We're getting a sense that there is this kind of targeted operation going on in this area in Moorfields near this alehouse, and that it's generally known that men who commit sodomy frequent this area. And essentially, Thomas Newton finds one of these men, as you can read in the text, and engages with him. And at that point of engagement, this man is arrested. Now, it's really interesting from this source because we don't hear much from the man who is arrested, William Brown, except the following. He says, "I did it because I thought I knew him, and I think there is no crime in making what use I please of my own body." And that's all we hear. Now, this is extremely fascinating material for a queer historian, because essentially what we're getting at here is we're getting a sodomite's voice. We're getting a sodomite speaking about, what they think has happened to them in this interaction with, in this case, the law. So we're getting this sense of the sodomite thinking he knows him. So he says, "I did it because I thought I knew him." He's talking about Thomas Newton. He's talking about this person who has sort of, gestured to him to engage in kind of intimacy. what we would term today cruising in a public space, he's gesturing, he's gesturing towards this idea that he thought he knew him. What did he know about him? What did he recognize about him? Did he recognize him as a type of man like him? Is this the beginnings of a kind of sense of gay identity? We don't know, but we do know that he thinks he knew him. I thought I knew him. And he adds then, I think there's no crime in making what use I please of my own body, which is an incredibly powerful response to a law, sodomy law, which essentially says sodomy is always non-consensual. It cannot be consensual because it's a crime. It's a violation. And here we have this ordinary man, William Brown, saying, there is no crime in making what use I please of my own body. So he's saying in some sense, I consented to this, that person consented to it. Because we're two men, we're both consenting, this should not be a crime. And that's all we get. That is the archive. That's the problem with the archive. It would be lovely if we could talk more to William Brown and find out more about, his habits, his kind of sense of himself, but we don't have that. So it's not quite there as an identity. William Brown isn't saying, as Richter Norton might claim, I'm a Molly, the 18th century version of a gay man, but he is saying things that absolutely inform the later activism to come from the mid-20th century onwards. This sense of same-sex intimacy, if consensual, between two adults, not being a crime. So we can see from this very kind of brief trial record, we can see the beginnings of a queer or gay identity in the past, but we're not quite there yet. So as I've been talking about the secret history of clubs, the Molly entry, and William Brown's trial record, these two texts are quite different. One is a satire, a literary satire. One is a legal record. Both are pointing to the potential for historians to think about the 18th century queerly. But both kind of tell us that the ways in which we can approach these texts are various. So we have scholars like Richter Norton calling the Molly House entry the basis for a gay subculture in the 18th century. We then have that criticised, I think rightly, by people like Cameron McFarlane, talking about the dangers of using a word like gay in its contemporary usage, using it in the past. So we know that as historians, we have to be really attuned to language, going back to Samuel Johnson's dictionary definition of queer. We have to think about the words that were available and what they may have meant at that time in the 18th century. So we have gay interpretations, we have critiques of that kind of interpretation. We also have trans interpretations of the Mollies. We have scholars like Julia Facek talking about the Mollies as potentially trans subjects in the past, or there's a potential for thinking about the transness of the Molly in the past. And then there's the question of how should we read the testimony of William Brown, somebody who clearly says that what they do with other men is in some way natural. They have a right to experience pleasure in their own body. And crucially, I thought I knew him. I thought I knew him. So there's a sense there that we can read into the testimony of someone like William Brown, that there may be a community, of men who share in their pleasures, in their desires, but it's not quite at the point where those men are identifying as being gay men. So we have to be very careful when we think about same-sex desire in the 18th century, in the past more broadly, to think about what is the meaning of that desire at that particular point in time in terms of the language. We do not have gay identities in the past. Sexuality is not an identity that people assume, but we know from accounts like the account of William Brown that people did think of their desire, their same-sex desire, as natural for them. And that is the basis of much to come in terms of activism, in terms of change in the arrangements of sexuality and desire that we get from gay liberation in the 1970s and onwards.